let's continue with our telling of The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. We're on chapter 4 called The Bell and the Hammer. There was no doubt about the magic this time. Down and down they rushed, first through the darkness and then through a mass of vague and whirling shapes which might have been almost anything. It grew lighter. Then, suddenly, they felt they were standing on something solid. A moment later, everything came into focus, and they were able to look about them. "What a weird place," said Diggory. "I don't like it," said Polly, with something like a shudder. What they noticed first was the light. It wasn't like sunlight, and it wasn't like electric light or lamps or candles or any other light they've ever seen. It was a dull, rather red light, and not cheerful. It was steady, and it did not flicker. They were standing on a flat paved surface, and buildings rose all around them. There was no roof overhead, and they were in a sort of a courtyard. The sky was extraordinarily dark, a blue almost black. When you had seen the sky, you wondered that there should be any light at all. There's a picture of what they're kind of coming to. "It's very funny, the weather here," said Diggory. "I wonder if we've arrived just in time for a thunderstorm, or maybe an eclipse." "I don't like it," said Polly. Both of them, without quite knowing why, were talking in whispers, and though there were no reason why they should still go on holding hands after their jump, they did not let go. The walls rose very high all around that courtyard. They had many great windows in them, windows without glass, through which you saw nothing but black darkness. Lower down there were great pillared arches, yawning blackly like mouths of railway tunnels. It was rather cold. The stone of which everything was built seemed to be red, but that might only be because of the curious light. It was obviously very old. Many of the flat stones that paved the courtyard had cracks across them. None of them fit closely together, and the sharp corners were worn off. One of the arched doorways was half filled with rubble. The two children kept turning around to look at the different sides of the courtyard. One reason that they were afraid of somebody or something looking at the windows at them when their backs were turned. "Do you think anybody lives here?" asked Diggory at last, still in a whisper. "No," said Polly. "It's all ruins. We haven't heard a sound since we came." "Let's stand still and listen for a bit," suggested Diggory. They stood still and listened, but all they could hear was a thump-thump of their own hearts. This place was at least as quiet as the wood between the worlds, but it was a different sort of quietness. The silence of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear trees growing, and full of life. This was a dead, cold, empty silence. You couldn't imagine anything growing in it. "Let's go home," said Polly. "But we haven't seen anything yet," said Diggory. "Now that we're here, we must simply have a look around. I'm sure there's nothing at all interesting. There's not much point in finding a magic ring that lets you look into other worlds if you're afraid to look at them when you've got there." "Who's talking about being afraid?" said Polly, letting go of Diggory's hand. "I only thought you didn't seem very keen on exploring this place. I'll go anywhere you go." "We can get away the moment we want to," said Diggory. "Let's take off our green rings and put them in our right-hand pockets. All we've got to do is remember that our yellow are in our left hand. You can keep your hand as near as your pocket as you like, but don't put it in, or you'll touch your yellow and vanish." They did this and went quietly up to one of the big arched doorways which led into the inside of the building. And when they stood on the threshold and looked in, they saw it was not so dark inside as they first had thought. It led to a vast, shadowy hall which appeared to be empty, but on the far side there was a row of pillars with arches between them, and through those arches there seemed to be some more of the same tired-looking light. They crossed the hall, walking very carefully for fear of holes in the floor or anything lying about that they might trip over. It seemed a long walk. When they had reached the other side, they came out through the arches and found themselves in another larger courtyard. "That doesn't look very safe," said Polly, pointing at a place where the wall bulged outward and looked as if it were ready to fall into the courtyard. In one place, a pillar was missing between the two arches, and the bit that came down to where the pillar ought to have been, there hung nothing to support it. Clearly, the place had been deserted for hundreds, if not thousands of years. "If it's lasted until now, I suppose it'll last a little bit longer," said Diggory, "but we must be very quiet. You know a noise sometimes brings things down, like an avalanche in the Alps." They went out of the courtyard into another doorway, up a great flight of steps, and through vast rooms that opened out to one another until you were dizzy with the mere size of the place. Every now and then they thought they were going to get out into the open and see what sort of country lay around the enormous palace, but each time they got into another courtyard. They must have been magnificent places where people were still living here. In one there had been a fountain. A great stone monster with widespread wings stood with its mouth open, and you could still see a bit of piping at the back of its mouth, out of which water used to pour. Under it was a wide stone basin to hold the water, but it was as dry as a bone. In other places where there were dry sticks of some sort of climbing plant which had wound itself around the pillars and helped pull some of them down, but it had died long ago. And there were no ants or spiders or any kind of other living thing you might expect to see in a ruin. And where the dry earth showed between the broken flagstones, there were no grass or moss. Here's a picture of the fountain. It was all so dreary and so much of the same that even Diggory was thinking they had better put on their yellow wings and get back to the warm green living forest in the in-between place, where when they came to two huge doors of some sort of metal that might have possibly been gold. One stood a little ajar, so of course they went to look in. Both started back and drew a long breath, for here at last was something worth seeing. All right, we will continue.